Hello, hello. Welcome or welcome back to English Extras. I'm Jean, and this is the podcast that takes you beyond textbook English. Today, I would like to present to you a very special guest who is here to talk to us about an important American holiday. I'd like to introduce T, who is currently a social worker in the health equity space and has been one of my dearest friends for over 10 years. T has 2 bachelor's degrees, one in sociology and the other in psychology. She is an avid reader, a plant mom, and a lover of gemstones and cozy sweaters. She's here today to talk to us about Juneteenth. The reason it's called Juneteenth is because it occurs on June 19th. So the name is a combination of the month and the number, and it has special significance in American history, both past and present. Here is our conversation about it. Enjoy. Hello, T. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here.
So, for listeners who may be hearing about Juneteenth for the first time, could you tell us about the significance of June 19th and a little about where it came from?
Of course, of course. So, what's important to know is that Juneteenth is a joyous celebration. Juneteenth, specifically, its origin story is related to the experiences of enslaved folks in Texas. Regionally, there are different freedom days depending on the state or the area of the country that you live in. But in general, Juneteenth is often regarded as the day to celebrate emancipation.
Something that has always stuck out to me about the date, specifically June 19th, 1865, is that it was more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And for context for our listeners, the Emancipation Proclamation was an order given by then President Abraham Lincoln that is historically seen as the end of slavery in the United States. This is oversimplifying it, the reality of it, but demonstrating the actual effects of the Emancipation Proclamation would have to be its own episode. So news of this change did not reach the people of Texas until almost 2 years later. So what does this delay tell you about how emancipation actually unfolded across the United States?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and complex question. And what's interesting there is that something to always remember is that the structure of chattel slavery is specifically American made. Even though there was slavery all across the world, it is a specifically American experience that if you are a slave, your children will become slaves, and so on. That generational inheritance of slavery is specifically American. And in regards to the slow reaching of that freedom news, that emancipation, I think that there were a couple of factors that contributed to that. One, I think that at the forefront of that conversation is noting that Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. There were abolitionists during that time. For our listeners, an abolitionist is someone who believed in the swift, right now abolishment of slavery, releasing everyone and having them then become full citizens. Abraham Lincoln was a strategist. And as you can imagine, if you're at war with people who rely on a free, repopulating workforce, saying that that workforce is no longer confined to enslavement weakens your enemies. So I think that that's one factor as to why it was so slow to reaching the people. And another component there can be literacy. So around this time, we're thinking, let's see here, that would be around the 1860s. There were about 4 million enslaved people. And maybe about 10% of those people had literacy. They were able to read and write and understand. So imagine a Union soldier comes, places something where many enslaved people can see it. That's great. I can't read. That's great. I'm see a document that says that I'm free, but for fear of death, fear of punishment, freedom isn't necessarily at the forefront for some of these folks.
So, on the subject of delays, Juneteenth did not become a federal holiday until 2021. And when it did, it gained a lot of national attention. What are your thoughts on the official recognition? Did you see it as progress? And what opportunities or challenges does this mainstream attention bring?
I think mainstream attention is important, but the more mainstream something is, the easier it is for the concept to get away from its original purpose. 2020 to 2022 was a really critical time in our country in which I think a lot of people for the first time were learning on a deeper detail about the racial history in this country. And I think given the context of the pandemic, of the way that people were relegated and isolated, knowing more means that now you have to sit with it and you have to process it. So while I believe that the official recognition was well intended, I also believe that it was essentially a little too late. Essentially, um, so I'm Southern, so we speak in a lot of euphemisms, but I think that it was a band aid for a bullet wound, which means that this remedy only took care of a very small aspect of the conversations that we were having during that time. While that official recognition is important, the undercurrent of what was also happening in our country was that we were restricting and turning away from the history that provided context to the holiday. So it's wonderful that you now get to understand a cultural celebration, maybe learn more about an experience that's very foreign to you, whether you're American or new to the country. If you understand that the holiday exists, but have no context for why the holiday is important, I think that that balance really shifted. And especially now with what we're seeing a lot of turning away from history, shying away from difficult truths about history. At the end of the day, Juneteenth is a celebration of freedom. It's a celebration that enslaved peoples learned that they were no longer enslaved and being able to liberate themselves from their circumstances.
One quick sidebar. Can you explain the difference and the significance of using a word like enslaved people versus slaves?
Sure. So language is important. And one thing that's super important is there were conversations in equity spaces, racial advocacy that talked about relegating the experiences of people to just one thing that they've gone through denies them of everything else that was happening in their lives. Slavery was their circumstance, but not their identity. So to say enslaved people acknowledges the horror of their circumstance. But during this time, people were still mothers, fathers, doctors, teachers. People were still getting married. Just as a sidebar to the sidebar, there is an enslaved people's practice known as jumping the broom. Jumping the broom is a marriage ritual, essentially. Most enslaved peoples were not considered citizens, which means that they were denied the legal practice of marriage. People still fall in love, people still want to get married. So, something that they would do would be at the end of their ceremonies, of their marriage ceremonies, a husband and wife would hold hands and they would jump over a broom. And then you would hang the broom in your home as a symbol of, like, yep, me and so are married. So, and that's a practice for descendants of enslaved people that's kind of making a resurgence. So, if you're ever at specifically a Black American wedding, and at the end, they'll tell you, hey, here's what we're doing, here's why we do it, and they jump over a broom, that's to honor their ancestors.
So, talking about history and how this affects people's understanding of history. So, given your background in social work, what impact do you think this knowledge has on how we process the ongoing legacy of slavery in America?
Honestly, I think learning about Juneteenth is a difficult conversation for people given our education system. I think a lot of the times our education system is so jam packed that we gloss over some of the complex experiences, the different American experiences of people that were harmed and are harmed by certain systems, certain practices, things like that. I feel like to truly understand the importance and significance of Juneteenth, you have to understand the horrors of chattel slavery. And I don't use that word lightly. Chattel slavery and the systemic impact that was created from that system did not stop. It just transformed itself. So from emancipation, and then you have Reconstruction. Reconstruction served as the foundation to Jim Crow South. And for some of our listeners, Jim Crow South is a term for a historical time where it was very out in the open, very blatant to see that Black people, other people of color were not allowed in certain spaces, were not allowed to use same facilities. A lot of the culture during the Jim Crow South was very dangerous. It was very dangerous. From Jim Crow South, if you're familiar with other things, that's where we get sundown towns, a lot of interesting infrastructure to make it to where, Black and brown help workers had to navigate the backs of houses and things like that. So we have a lot of Jim Crow South then bleeding into the civil rights era. Even from the civil rights era and a lot of the conversations and legislation reform that was happening during that time, the culture didn't necessarily change and continue to change until the 80s and 90s. It's a really upsetting dissonance to have to connect all of those instances in history. So, for example, I'm a 30-year-old millennial woman. My grandmother was about 13 or 14 during Jim Crow South, and she's still alive. So she still vividly remembers what my tiny town that I'm originally from, she still remembers, oh yeah, people who look like us were not allowed on this side of town unless you were cooking, cleaning, nannying, things like that. So I think that dissonance also comes from a comfort of it being really far away when it's not. Even my mother, she was born in 1973. That was what, 5 years, 6 years after the Voting Act of 1965 was ratified. So these are people who are still alive and still remember the almost apartheid like times in America.
Speaking of connections, my final question for you. What connections do you see between the themes of this holiday and current social movements or issues facing Black Americans? And what would you want people to take away from learning about Juneteenth?
So I'm going to set the scene as a Black American woman, Black American cisgendered woman living right now. I often make this joke where one thing Black people are going to do is have fun. In times of triumph, I truly believe that my Black American heritage is having fun in the face of like mind shattering tragedy. One thing Black people are going to do is find a crumb of joy, hold on to it, spread it around, ensure that everyone feels seen, heard, loved, those things. I think what I would most want people to take away from this holiday is that it's not just about us. Although we are the focus, although the freeing of enslaved Black American people is at the epicenter, community is what saves us. So joining in, feeling brave, like I said, joining in the celebration, feeling brave, feeling connected to the community. I mean, enslavement hurt everyone. E- everything. It's not just a siloed experience. The systems that were put in place to disenfranchise Black American people also affect everyone else. I think overall, I'd like people to know that the recognition of Juneteenth doesn't limit American history, but it expands it. I believe that to love something is to be proud of it and to also recognize ways that it can be better. Recognize the ways that something you love has caused harm to other people. And we can have a much deeper conversation about that one. But for just this moment in time, I think that to know better is to do better. And by recognizing Juneteenth, it's an opportunity to have an authentic and sincere conversation about the racial history in this country. And from there, make a plan to ensure that the culture, the hatred, the vitriol surrounding race and ethnicity in this country can stop.
Thank you so, so much for joining us today. Thank you for taking your time and sharing with us.
Happy to be here. Is this how the kids do it? Is this how it's supposed to be done?
Perfect.
I was about to say, I'm still a millennial, so I do it this way, but I feel like that's wrong as well. But thank you so much for having me.